All right, I want to bring in CBN's Chuck Holton now. Chuck just got back from a trip to Syria, and we had the reports on CBN News YouTube and on FaithWire and CBNNews.com, and it was just really compelling stuff. And we saw a Christian village getting bombarded there. He spoke with the people. We've got news now of ISIS regaining steam and actually controlling some territory, and a positive story on a church being rebuilt in Raqqa. So we'll cover all that and more. I want to talk to Chuck Holton here, and glad you're back safe, Chuck.
Me too. I always buy a round trip ticket.
I mean, it's just, it's wild, you know, when you're in that region, you just never know what's going to happen. But I wanted you to explain what was going on in this video. We're seeing some of it now, but you spoke to these people, and it's a largely Christian village, and it's getting shelled and bombarded, causing all these people to sort of flee. What was going on there?
Right. So it's not just one village, Dan. It's a whole string of villages, over 30 of them. And these are ancient Christian villages. As a matter of fact, the Christians that live there still speak Aramaic in their services, church services, the language that Jesus spoke. It's the last places on earth where you will find Aramaic spoken. And so these villages have been there for millennia. But they're in northern Syria along the Habur River Valley, and that's right on the Turkish border up there. Turkey, for some time, has been trying to create a buffer zone, they call it, because they say that the Kurdish forces, specifically the PKK, are a terror group that they've been designated a terror group by the United States as well. And so they're using that as an excuse to drive out all the people who live in that region. Now, in reality, what they're trying to do is make space to resettle some of the 2.3 million refugees that have come into Turkey from Syria over the last 10 years. The problem is that most of those refugees have come from the western part of Syria around Aleppo and Damascus and that area, which is still controlled by the regime. And Turkey really doesn't want to go to war with the regime. And so it's easier for them to take territory in the eastern part of Syria, which is a self-administered area by the Kurds that form the Syrian Democratic Forces, or SDF. So Turkey is using sort of what I would call the United Nations of ISIS, called the Free Syrian Army, to do its dirty work in that area. And they're going in and driving out Christians, Kurds, Yazidis, Druze, and other minorities that live in eastern northeast Syria, I guess, and trying to create that buffer zone. So that's why we're seeing them bombard these villages on really a daily basis. They're just trying to deny that territory to the people who have lived there for generations. And then eventually, when they get tired and flee, then they will move in these Syrian Muslim Arab majority people from Turkey into that area.
And how do the people generally react around there? I mean, it's such a different situation than what we're used to over here, obviously. But I know when the land was split up and the Kurds kind of weren't given a country. And so that's why you have, the Kurds, the Iraqi Kurds, and then you've got the PKK, they're kind of differing on how they want to approach statehood for themselves, right? So what is sort of the dynamic, just from the average person there on the ground, where do their loyalties lie typically?
Well, so I mean, for most Americans, they don't understand the intricacies of all of this, but just to put it very simply, the Kurds are the largest people group on earth that don't have their own nation, 37 million people. So for example, the country I live in Panama here, there's only 4 million people in Panama. They have their own country. Armenia, for example, 2.5 million people, they have their own country. But the Kurds are 37 million people and they don't have their own country. So they inhabit northern Iraq, Iran, southern part of Turkey, and part of Syria in the east. And so they have been agitating for their own country for a long time. Nobody really wants to give up any of their territory to give them their own country, though. And so that's where we run into problems. I think right now they're probably as close to having their own country as they will ever be, because they are administering the eastern half of Syria, more or less. in an area they call Rojava. It's basically everything east of the Euphrates River inside Syria. They also have Kurdistan, which is a self-administered area in the north of Iraq, and their capital there is Erbil. Now, the Kurds, being that they're one people group, doesn't mean that they're the same ideology. There are lots of different political parties, over 30 political parties in Kurdistan. So you imagine how divided America is with two basic political parties. Well, Kurdistan is very divided with over 30 political parties. The PKK is one of those, and the PKK is a very communist-leaning political party. They have others which are not so left-leaning, like the YPG and the KRG in northern Iraq and others. But suffice it to say that the people who live in that area, they just want to live in peace.
Yeah.
They just want somebody who will maintain order and provide basic services like electricity and running water and things like that. And they want to be able to worship the way they want to worship. And this is not a religiously homogenous area. It's majority Muslim, but there are lots of Christians that live in the eastern part of Syria. There are these Yazidis, which is another religious minority. There are Druze, there are Syriac Christians, there are all sorts of groups that live there. And up until the civil war started, they pretty much maintained peace. Everybody just sort of lived and let live. But with the rise of ISIS and ISIS coming in and taking over that region, the Kurds saw that as an opportunity to drive ISIS out and hold that land for themselves. And so that's kind of where we are today. The Kurds now administer Rojava, that eastern part of Syria. They have a lot of ISIS, former ISIS members that they have in camps, that embrace it, basically imprisoned in that area. They're relying on United States funding and help and support to be able to manage that. They're right now talking about releasing 850 former ISIS members because they simply can't support them. They can't feed them. And that isn't going to bode well for that area, because these people have not gotten any less extreme, these former ISIS members, since they got put in prison camps. They've been more extreme. And so I would say there's going to be a lot of fighting that you'll see in that area in coming months. Now, there's basically, you have to understand this. There's three basic teams that are all playing power politics over Syria right now. You have the regime, which is Bashar al-Assad and his forces. They're backed by Russia. That's one team. You have the Syrian Democratic Forces, or the SDF, and they're backed by the United States. Then you have Turkey, and they support the Free Syrian Army, which is, like I said, the United Nations of ISIS, because the Free Syrian Army, as it exists today, was formed by Raqqa falling. Raqqa, you remember, was the capital of ISIS, of the ISIS caliphate. And when that fell, there were about 40,000 ISIS members who fled into Turkey and put on FSA uniforms and then came back to Syria. So those guys are all former ISIS members. They're just as brutal, just as extreme as they ever were. But now they're supported by the 8th largest military on earth.
Unbelievable.
Turks. And that's not good. So you're not looking at things getting more peaceful anytime soon in Syria.
Yeah, man, really, really crazy stuff. And you had talked about that ISIS, this is something that's kind of flying under the radar in the mainstream media, is that ISIS is sort of rebuilding and sort of regaining some momentum here.
Right. Now, as you read more into the complexities of this region, ISIS is not actually one homogenous unit or team that is fighting. They're all fighting each other. There's these different fronts, these different factions of ISIS that are all fighting. So, like I said, the Free Syrian Army is made up of former ISIS fighters. They're pushing from the north, from Turkey down into Syria. But now we have former ISIS members that have formed another cell who are picking up in Deir ez-Zor. That's the place where they were ultimately defeated, where the ISIS caliphate was ultimately defeated in 2019. I was there for that, in a place called Baghouz. Now, that's a very remote area of southern, East Syria, right along the Euphrates River. And that ISIS faction is now starting to retake ground. They're starting to control territory, which means that they're outlawing smoking, for example, in that area. Things like that, like they did all across the caliphate when they took over back in 2014. So that's a real concern. Of course, we have about 900 U.S. troops in Deir ez-Zor, in that same region, guarding the oil fields down there. And so they're at risk. We have the ISIS events in the last week where ISIS fighters are killing Syrian regime forces again. So everybody fighting everybody fighting over that region. And of course, if ISIS starts to retake ground, you have to ask why. You have to ask why now? What is it that emboldened these people to start to think that they could hold territory when before, if they tried that, they would have been bombed into oblivion from the sky? Well, the answer to that question goes back to what happened in Afghanistan in August of this year.
Yeah.
And the horrible pullout, the absolute debacle that we saw, which gave all of our adversaries around the world the idea that if you're going to stand up, now is the time, because America is weak. It is led by a weak president, and the Americans are tired of war. They'll run away and they don't want to do anything. And so you're going to see more of that in this area as we come up to the end of this year, because there's one other event that's going to influence ISIS and what they're going to do in Syria over the next coming months. And that is that the United States has announced that they're going to end combat operations in neighboring Iraq. And so basically you're going to see a pullout from Iraq, almost like what you saw in Afghanistan. And that is emboldening all of these factions in Syria to step up their game and try to take some territory.
Yeah. And that is really, it's a shocking turn when you consider, all that was spent to get ISIS out of there. And, I did go there one time in 2015, and I was, outside of Sinjar. And I can remember at that time, they were just waiting. Like, they were just like, well, we could get them out of there. And they ended up taking the town in like a day. And they were like, well, we had to wait. And there was all, you could see the supply trucks from ISIS just going around. And there was so much politics involved in that. And Obama was in at the time. And man, when you talk about that, a repeat pullout, kind of like what we had in Afghanistan, and you think about the opportunity they're going to see, it's just, they're like ants. They just come right back in, as soon as that vacuum's out of there, and there's no airstrikes, there's no, backup and help. They come back in like ants. And when, it's tough for the Iraqis when they don't have that support backing them, which side do you choose? And that's why you see somebody like ISIS that can just, everyone's like, well, how can they run roughshod over a whole section of a country like that? Well, when you see it and how it's all laid out, and then where the loyalties are and the lack of help they have, you can understand it.
That's right. The Iraqis took, I'm sorry, ISIS back in 2014, when they took Mosul, the second largest city in Iraq, they took it with only a couple thousand fighters, and there were something like 15,000 Iraqi army troops in the city at the time. So you'd think, how did 2,000 fighters beat 15,000 Iraqi troops? Well, it's because the Iraqi troops knew they didn't have any support. They dropped their weapons and ran away and left all kinds of equipment for ISIS when they took over Mosul. Well, you could see that happen again, and it could be ISIS. I mean, ISIS attacks are on the increase in Iraq as well right now. We saw over the last weeks an attack in Diyala and an attack in Sulaymaniyah. Both of those were pretty large attacks, killed like 70 people or something. But there is also the issue of the Hashashabi in, that's the Iranian-backed Shia militias in Iraq that are just waiting for the United States to leave so that the Shiites can take over Iraq again. Remember, the Ba'ath Party was Shia back in the days of the former dictator in Iraq. So when Saddam Hussein got pushed out, that's what started the whole war to begin with. So again, there are so many players that are vying for this region. We didn't even talk about Iran and how they want to establish an Iranian crescent land bridge into Lebanon from Tehran through Syria.
Yeah.
So everybody has their eye on this region. And I'll just make some predictions. You're going to
Okay.
see between now and let's say the end of January, the United States is going to have a massive pullout from Iraq. There are some sort of secret talks between the US and the Kurds about reestablishing or augmenting our bases in Kurdistan to sort of make up for that.
Mm.
And that's one thing that would put a check on Turkey. But you're going to see a rise or a reinvigoration of ISIS across Syria and Iraq, and you're going to see a pullout of the U.S. forces from Iraq, and you're going to see an increase of U.S. forces in Kurdistan.
Mm. Well, that would be at least one positive development, because I mean, Iraqi Kurdistan, it is really interesting as you think about going to Iraq and you think it's, this Muslim country. Of course it is, but then you're in Iraqi Kurdistan and it's like, it almost feels like America, Middle East.
You're right.
And it's just a very interesting place to be. And it feels, much more similar to what you'd feel like around here to somewhat.
Yeah, Kurdistan is surprisingly modern. It's very safe there. I would have no problem taking my family there. And if we have any friends in that region, it's the Kurds.
Yeah.
But the problem is the Kurds don't trust us. None of our allies.
And why would they? Why would they? I mean, we've bailed out on them so many times.
Not only that, but after they saw what just happened in Afghanistan,
Yeah.
they're even less likely to trust us.
Mm-hmm.
So the United States has lost a tremendous amount of face, a tremendous amount of prestige, and a tremendous amount of influence, not just in that region, but around the globe. And we are seeing the ripple effects of that in that region right now.
All right. Well, I appreciate you bringing that to us, Chuck. But I want to finish here on a positive note. You were with the Free Burma Rangers, a fantastic organization led by Dave Eubank, and we've reported on him many times. And they were rebuilding a church in Raqqa. Tell me about that.
That's right. As one of the only Christian churches, it's the only one there now that didn't get destroyed. There were several Christian churches in Raqqa before ISIS took over, but when ISIS declared their caliphate and made Raqqa the capital, they destroyed all the churches in Raqqa. And this particular church was used as an ISIS headquarters underneath. They dug a big pit underneath the church because they figured it wouldn't be bombed by the coalition. They destroyed the church proper, but they left the superstructure or the infrastructure, or the roof and everything in place. And then they had a headquarters underneath there. When ISIS was driven out, this is a couple years ago, the Free Burma Rangers came into Raqqa right after that happened and found this destroyed church, prayed about it, and said, what can we do? Well, they went back to the States and they started raising money, and a lot of great American Christians donated money to rebuild that church in Raqqa, and it's now been finished. The rebuilding is done. And so while we were there this trip, we got to have the first service to dedicate or rededicate that Armenian Apostolic Church in Raqqa. Now, that church had 150 families that attended it before ISIS took over. But now all of those families have been driven out. There are only 15 Armenian Christians left in Raqqa, they say, and most of them attended the service this time. And they were all in tears. They were all saying, I can finally do this again in public, in my house of worship here. And they're just praying that God will repopulate that area with Christians and refill that church that we've now rebuilt. Yeah,
amazing. Something that we can all be praying for. I mean, we take for granted something like our building to worship in. I mean, we've got our pick of the litter on which church do you want to go to, every different kind of denomination, and at our fingertips. And to see that, people weeping that they just have a place to go safely worship because it's so dangerous over there. So
and it's still risky for them. I mean, even in the week or two since the church was finished, there are a couple of bullets that have been fired at the front of the church. It's surrounded by a big wall and has a full-time caretaker there. But I mean, being a Christian in that region is going to be risky no matter what, especially with ISIS trying to make a comeback in that area. But the Christians that we talk to are undaunted. They want to come and worship. and they are very happy to have a place where they can worship now. And it just is sort of one of those sort of love wins moments.
Yeah.
You can keep destroying the building, but you're not going to destroy the body of Christ.
Amazing.
And the body of Christ is going to come back, and they're going to continue to worship there. The other cool thing about it is that we rededicated the church on the 1-year anniversary of the end of the war in Armenia in the Nagorno-Karabakh last year. I know Armenians, have a lot of depressing things that have happened over the last year. They lost almost 5,000 of their young men in that 44-day war in the Nagorno-Karabakh between them and Azerbaijan and Turkey.
Yeah.
But now, on the same day that they that they memorialize the end of that war, we rededicated this church and these Armenians said that was a really encouraging moment for them. That was pretty cool.
Amazing faith, and certainly something that we can all be praying for over here stateside, our fellow brothers and sisters in Christ, just living under such intense, persecution and danger. So, and I appreciate you going over there, Chuck. I mean, your reports are always fascinating, seeing them from the ground, and you're going into these dangerous areas to bring us these stories, and we definitely appreciate that and appreciate you stopping by.
Yeah, there's so much going on in the world, and we get so wrapped around the axle about stupid things that are happening in the United States.
True.
It is important, I think, to know what believers around the world are facing, and that's why I keep doing this.